Alice, I'm Director of Temple World Travel. We're operating the group tour to Crete and Santorini in September for the alumni travel programme for the universities of Cambridge and Oxford. I'm just going to share my screen. As some of you may already know, Temple World was founded in the 1970s by my father, who's an archaeologist, with the idea of taking students out to see digs and research in action overseas. Over the years, we've evolved into a worldwide small group tour specialist operating tours for universities and museums like the British Museum and the Smithsonian, all led by experts and academics. We've been designing tours for Oxford and Cambridge since the very start of the alumni travel programme a few decades ago now. Alongside the small group tours, we also put together tailor-made holidays for private clients worldwide. We have 7 tours planned for 2022 for alumni of Oxford and Cambridge. As you can see, it's quite a diverse range of tours. We have wildlife-based trips, such as our Madagascar tour, which is led by a conservationist and environmentalist. We have archaeology-themed tours, like our Turquoise Coast tour in September, our very popular Eternal Egypt tour, which we've designed specifically to appeal to both first and repeat people who may have travelled to Egypt before. We go quite far off the beaten track on that one. And then our Archaeological Jewels of Jordan tour, which is actually going 22nd of April, and we do still have a couple of spots on that if anybody fancies a last-minute trip to go on. The trip I'd like to highlight today is, of course, our Minoan, Crete and Santorini tour. We're running it in September, and the trip scholar on that tour is none other than Professor John Bennet, who will be telling us all about the history of Crete in our talk today. For those who might be interested in visiting Crete on our tour, here's where we'll be going. It's a 12-day tour spent in 3 main hubs, seeing as many of the island's Minoan palaces, towns and remains as we can, whilst keeping the pace relatively easygoing. We start in the very beautiful Venetian port town of Armchair, which has an atmospheric harbour. There's time to explore, and we'll also visit Armchair next. Just slightly over to the, I apologise, it's actually on the wrong part of the map. It should be over to the east of the city. It's got some impressive Roman cisterns. In the south of the island, we'll visit Fresco, which was the 2nd largest town in Minoan Crete, the classical site of Gortys, and the small Minoan palace at Alga Triada nearby. In 1908, a clay disc, now known as the Phaistos disc, was found at the site. It has a series of stamped symbols on it and has never been deciphered. You can see it in the Heraklion Museum later in the tour. Moving our base to Heraklion, we'll obviously be visiting the Minoan palace at Knossos, which was controversially reconstructed about 120 years ago by the English archaeologist Sir Arthur Evans. And we'll pop over to Santorini, and that's to see Akrotiri. That was buried in volcanic ash, a little bit like Pompeii, but of course far earlier. The fast catamaran only takes a couple of hours each way. Head back over towards the east of the island. We're obviously going to be visiting Malia Minoan Palace and the late Minoan town of Gornia, which was once the capital of a Roman province that spanned Crete and part of Libya as well. We'll be staying in the lovely coastal town of Ilunda, and there's time to visit the fascinating little island of Spinalonga, which has a bit of a dark past as a leper colony, which only closed in 1957, but has a really beautiful Venetian fortress on it, which you can see in my next slide. We're flying out of Heraklion at the end. The best part is that, of course, Professor Bennet will be with us to explain everything as we see it, and that adds an awful lot of extra depth with his knowledge of Linear A, Linear B, and all of the history of Crete alongside that. I'm just going to show you a few quick images because those will do an awful lot better job than I can. Here we have the wonderful harbour at Armchair with its Venetian storehouses. Next we have the restored theatre at Aptera, which was actually only reopened in 2015. There's Heraklion with its pretty impressive Venetian fort. This is that controversial restoration at the Palace of Knossos, which I'm sure will be very familiar to many of you. And here's one of the most famous friezes, the dolphin frieze from the palace, again reconstructed with really only small fragments having been available for them to interpret what was there before. Still very beautiful. And here's the lovely Roman site of Gortyn. It's famous for its Code of Gortyn, which is a 5th century record inscribed in Dorian on all kinds of matters of law, and it's found on the walls of one of the civic buildings in the Agora. Here's that Venetian fortress on Spinalonga Island. And we finish in the very lovely village of Ilunda. I think even if you've been to Crete before, it's well worth returning on this particular trip, because it really is a unique opportunity to see it with a scholar on hand to give huge depth and context to what you're seeing. Just before I go, if you're feeling inspired after today's talk and you'd like the details of our Minoan Crete tour, or in fact any of our alumni tours, you can find them all on our website, templeworld.com, or on the University Alumni website too. On our website, you get to the alumni tours by clicking on the tab at the top of the page. I'll now hand over to Professor Bennet, and I'll be here again at the end to put some of the questions you've sent when you registered to him before we finish for the night. If you have any questions as we go along, pop them in the message box and I'll try and include them at the end as long as we've got time. Thanks so much. Over to you, John.
Great, thanks very much. One, can I be heard?
Yes.
And two, can you all see a PowerPoint in front of you? Excellent, good. So I'm going to talk about Crete. I'm going to try and do what's really impossible, which is talk about 9,000 and more years of history in probably about 40 minutes. And there are sort of three major themes that I want to, that will sort of run through the talk. The first of them, and I deliberately chose this image, which is not how ancient people approached Crete, but how I approached it about 3 years ago now when I was giving a talk in the west of Crete by plane. But it gives you a very good sense of the fact that it's an island, obviously, and so the sea acts both as a connector and as a divider between the island and the rest of the world. The second thing I want to stress is both the diversity that the topography of Crete enforces, and also because it's a single island, its unity, and then ultimately the fact that its global position makes it fall very much between what we think of as the East and of the West. So I'll talk first of all about the very first visitors to the island and its first settlers, first permanent settlers. Then I'll focus a little bit on the Palatial Bronze Age, which is often called the Minoan period, which is divided actually into two major phases, the old and the new palaces, as we call them. And then we'll look briefly at Thera and what happened to Crete, not immediately following, but following the eruption of Thera, which disrupted the Aegean probably for about a century after the eruption happened. Crete then becomes what we often call Mycenaean, by which we mean that we know there were Greek speakers in charge at the site of Knossos in that period. And then, like the rest of the Eastern Mediterranean, there's something of a collapse and then a reformulation in Crete's case, as typically called the Crete of 100 cities, a much more diverse range of smaller polities from the Archaic to the Roman period. And of course, it then becomes part of the Roman Empire, which itself becomes the Byzantine Empire. There's a small period, an Islamic period of Arab control before it returns to Byzantium and then becomes Venetian and Ottoman, and in 1913 joined the modern Greek nation state. So we have 9,000 years of history. I thought worth just giving a brief overview. We start around 7,000 BCE with the Neolithic, the earliest Neolithic. There's 4,000 years of Neolithic before we reach what we call the Bronze Age. That's split into the early, middle, and late Minoan periods, as we call them. The middle and late Minoan periods are the period we're mainly concerned with for the palaces. And then Crete joins the sort of familiar sort of classical terminology, the Archaic, the classical Hellenistic period, with the death of Alexander, and then in 67 is incorporated within the Roman Empire with a single capital at the site of Gortyn in southern Crete. That shades into the Byzantine Empire Arab, Byzantine, Venetian, Ottoman, and ultimately Union, and we're just after 2000 BC, 2000 AD, sorry, or CE. Worth mentioning, one of my interests particularly is in writing. In a relatively short period, looking at this graph, but about 1,000 years, Crete had 3 different syllabic writing systems, and then it picked up the alphabetic writing system early in the first millennium CE. Sorry, early in the first millennium BC, I beg your pardon. The first visitors to Crete, if you'd asked me this question 15 years ago, I would have said they were probably the Neolithic settlers at Knossos and undoubtedly other places that have not been found yet on the island. But relatively recent field work has revealed some what we call Mesolithic signs of habitation in the south central part of the island. The modern city of Rethymno is at the top of the slide there, and the places mentioned are Plakias and Aios Pavlos a little bit further to the east. And these date to somewhere between 11 and 9,000 before the present. And one of those sites, the sites around Plakias, may well actually have earlier stuff from the Middle Paleolithic, as early as 130,000 years before the present. And then even more recently, some scratchings, I would call them, but cave art in the Asfendu cave in Sfakia, just a little bit further west, has been tentatively dated probably to around about 20,000 BP, and this would make it certainly the earliest parietal art on Crete, and probably throughout Greece. Those people were coming by sea, because Crete has always been an island, even during the last glacial maximum. They were coming probably as hunter-foragers, hunting the indigenous fauna, which is, as an island, typically small hippopotami and elephants and so on, and larger rodents, etc., but no major scavengers, as it were. Crete's a big island, 260 kilometers wide from west to east, as you can see. Its widest point, north to south, 56 kilometers, 12 kilometers in the narrowest part, in the isthmus towards the east. 2 of the major towns there, just for reference, we heard about a little bit earlier, Chania in the west and Iraklion in the center. It has 3 major mountain ranges, the White Mountains in the west, Pachnes is the main peak, the Psiloritis or Ether Massif in the center, and towards the east, the Dicti Massif. And you can see that those are all over 2,000 meters. And just for reference, Olympus, the highest mountain in Greece, is only a few hundred meters higher than those. And you can imagine what the effect of going from that height above sea level down to sea level in a relatively short distance has on topography. So as I was saying, that if we go back to the last glacial maximum, when very much unlike today, the ice caps were much, much larger and there was less water around. Many of the islands of the Aegean would have been connected by dry land, but Crete has never been, even though the crossings from land to Crete would have been a little bit shorter than they are nowadays. One of the important points to make is that these people who visited Crete before the Neolithic settlers went there temporarily. They went to hunt and then went back to their home base or moved on to other places. But this knowledge of the location probably stayed within human memory. And I've put these 2 slides on the right up because one of them is from the island of Kythera, which is this yellow dot here, just off the southern coast of the Peloponnese. And I hope you can just see it. There's a little bump just there, and then a bigger bump just there. The bigger bump is actually Crete. And so Crete, in terms of colonization, is actually quite a big target when you're looking at it across the sea level, at sea level, unlike coming down from an aeroplane, as I was. And then more specifically, as you come in to the harbour at Iraklion, which you see in the bottom right, this very prominent mountain sits behind the harbour, as it were, and that's Mount Yuktas. And here's a 17th century engraving which shows exactly that same profile. It's thought to be Zeus lying on his back. But the point is, it's a very important landmark. And so it's probably no accident that the first permanent settlers were guided in, if you like, by that mountain and moved up the valley to the site that we now call Knossos. It was a small knoll. You can see what it roughly looked like before it was settled in the contours on the left. And it overlooks a small valley which runs out to the coast, which is to the right of the slide as you're looking at it, but it's bounded on the south by a smaller stream which feeds into that stream that goes north-south. The first settlement there was tiny. It was in metric terms 0.35 of a hectare, a habitation of maybe 70 people, and that isn't a viable human population to sustain itself through time. So we're almost certain that these people either receive more people and more animals and crops and so on, or they maintain contact. But at present, we don't know of any other settlement on Crete at this date other than at Knossos. There must have been some, they just are very ephemeral and we haven't found them. Those people lived on the site, as we've seen, for longer than 4,000 years, but in those 4,000 years, they built up the site with about 5 or more meters of deposit. So it formed what we call in Middle Eastern terms, a tell site, and that's what you see on top of which the later Minoan palace was built. Now, those people came to Crete, obviously speaking a language. And that was the first language, obviously, introduced permanently onto the island. It existed maybe in semi-isolation or with minimal contact for 4,000 years, and so will have evolved, as all languages do, over that period of time. By the end of the 4th millennium, so by around about 3000 BCE, all of the other islands, even the tiniest islands in the Aegean, which are covered by this oval, had been colonized. And indeed, some of those people probably reached Crete because there's a bit of a population spike and a site increase in exactly that time period, the 4th millennium BCE. And it's very likely that they brought in at least one other language, one that may have been spoken either in the islands or on either of the two mainlands, what we think of as the Greek mainland and the Turkish mainland. There was a great deal of interaction over the 3rd millennium BCE across that area, and it brought objects like the sauce boat that you see there on the left, a ceramic form which was used for pouring, possibly for drinking of wine and so on, so points to rituals, etc., of commensality, and the very familiar Cycladic figurines, which are produced of Cycladic marble, but made their way around the Aegean. The source boat is typically a mainland form, but it's found on Crete, it's found in the islands. The Cycladic idols are a Cycladic form, as their name suggests, and they're found on Crete. And this particular one was found in a tomb in the south part of the island. And some of them are clearly made on Crete as well, because they don't conform to the same style as the other, the ones in the islands. Now, at this point, Crete is very much on the edge, the southern edge of an Aegean world, if you like, bounded by the modern country of Turkey, Greece on the west, and so on. And across the sea to the south is Africa. The south is on the right, obviously, on this slide. And slightly over the horizon is Asia, the Levantine coast and on into Mesopotamia and so on. At around 2000 BC, so the very end of the 3rd millennium, something changed. And what changed was the introduction of sail-powered craft. This is reflected in some decoration that we have from the early 2nd millennium on seal stones found on the island of Crete. But it effectively collapsed the distance between Crete and the Eastern Mediterranean and Egypt, in the same way that the jet airliner collapsed distance for tourists in the post-Second World War boom in tourism. And the effect of that was to bring in new materials into Crete, like ivory from Egypt and from Syria and so on, stone vessels which were manufactured in Egypt and were copied in Crete, and scarab seals, which are familiar from Egypt again, and very possibly the notion of writing. A lot of this seems to have been mediated by the major town of Byblos on the coast, the Levantine coast. And it's interesting that at this time, Byblos had a writing system, a syllabic writing system, undeciphered as yet, not very many examples of it. But it's interesting that the Aegean develops a writing system which is syllabic and linear rather than hieroglyphic, like the Egyptian writing system, which is also logosyllabic rather than syllabic, and not cuneiform, like the writing systems used in Mesopotamia and up into Anatolia as well. And the other difference that the Aegean world uses is they always stamped seals when they were sealing objects or documents and so on, rather than rolling them, the cylinder seal, which is typical of the Middle Eastern world and so on. So that points to the fact that this is not simply ex-oriente looks, these sort of waves of progress emanating from the East, but very much a selection, an active appropriation of materials and modification of them and adaptation of them into the local context, very much a two-way process. And the first Aegean writing system is attested around about 2000 BC. We call it the Archanes script because of where it was found. The site of Archanes is about 10, 15 kilometers south of Knossos in a cemetery. And it is rather difficult to read. We can't read it, it's undeciphered. But it's also difficult because it combines image and text. Is this cat on this very small seal stone supposed to convey meaning, or is it simply an image? While these signs, because we have them on other clay documents, are clearly signs of a script. So that's the very earliest writing. And what's rather interesting is that it appears more or less at the same time, but really just before the so-called palaces appear. In this period of the first palaces, we know that Crete was in contact with the Eastern world through ports like Ugarit and Ras Shamra in Syria, and ultimately Mari on the Euphrates. And we have a document from the period of Zimri Lim, about 1770 BC, which talks about the sale of tin to a trader coming from Crete. And Crete in that world was called Kaptaru. It's also known in Egyptian as Keftiu, probably the same word, but just mediated through those two different languages, Akkadian versus Egyptian. And we have examples of Cretan material culture in Egypt in this early second millennium phase as well. Now, around about 2000, probably about 1900 BC, we get these very characteristic architectural forms that we refer to as palaces. You can see them here, the three major palaces, the ones that are built earliest and last the longest. The site of Knossos, of course, in the north, not on the coast, but just a little bit inland, as we were saying. The site of Malia, a little bit further east, and the site of Festos, dominating the Meseret plain in the south part of the island. And the word palace has a double meaning for us. Formally and architecturally, it means a building complex surrounding central courts, which you see highlighted here on each of these aerial views, and typically with an open west court approachable from the west, which is pointed out with the arrows there. Now, that form appears relatively suddenly around about 1900 BCE, as I said, but the other sense of palace, and the sense in which it is used often across broadly the Eastern Mediterranean, is a social form, social term, meaning a certain type of sophistication of organization, often with written administration, with storage, loosely redistribution, the gathering in and redistributing of commodities. All of this backed up by ritual and by feasting and other rituals, etc. This seems to have been underway before the formal architectural palaces appeared. So we actually think that much of the sort of social movement, if you like, was happening before 2000 BC, and it was sort of monumentalized in these spaces, which had already become gathering spaces for many people. The palaces sit very comfortably within their landscape. They themselves are carefully choreographed. You're looking at diagrams of the way in which you would approach the main open interior spaces, the central courts of all three of the main palaces. And you can see that access is very carefully controlled. This is, I have to say, in the slightly later phase of the palaces. They're a bit more open and permeable in the older palace phase. But not only is access within the buildings controlled, but the buildings themselves form a ring around this open central court. And scholars such as Jan Driessen, a Belgian colleague of mine, have suggested that that in fact is to mimic the landscape around the palaces themselves, because, as I said, they sit very comfortably within that landscape. So on the left, you can see a view down the valley of Knossos, not a view that would have been open to a Minoan because it's an air view, but you can see Mount Yucatás dominating the southern horizon, as it does from almost everywhere in the Knossos Valley. In the bottom two slides on the right, you'll see the site of Festos, and Festos is aligned on one of the peaks of Mount Ida, and this hole you can see in the snow there is a sacred cave, while looking southeastwards, this little peak here, in fact, is the mountain I have as my background, Mount Kofinas, way away on the south coast, but it had a sanctuary on top of it. So Festos, the place, was situated within this sacred landscape, if you want to call that. And then just a reminder that there were not only were there peak-top sanctuaries, but there were also caves, and that you're looking at one of them, the Psychro cave in the Dictaean mountain range. So these were court-centered buildings, which is the way some people who don't like to use the term palace because they think that has too much baggage attached to it, but they're places of history. If you think about it, Knossos had a history of 5,000 years already before the palace was built. Those 5,000 years marked by the tell on which it sat, and places of performance of commensality, performance of ritual, performance of music, dance, etc. And they acted as a frame within the landscape, but a frame that embodied the sort of permanence or monumental time. The palace itself did not change while humans came and went with the generations and so on, except occasionally that certainty was disrupted by natural events such as earthquakes or massive eruptions. Just a little bit about the history of writing. The Cretan hieroglyphic script that I referred to, which really begins in Archanes, you see it at the top of this little diagram, overlaps with and is succeeded by a script which Sir Arthur Evans dubbed Linear A. And then after the fall of the palaces, around about 1450 BCE, the script of Linear B comes into use, which records an early form of Greek, and all writing is lost in the Aegean around about 1200 BCE. I thought it was worth just giving a little impression of what it's like to approach and move around the palace at Knossos. An aerial view here of the approach down what has come to be called the Royal Road, which you see on the right here, dividing into two, one area leading to a performance area. This is the monumental entranceway up here into the central court, modified in the later palace. And these are some of the massive storage jars that were in these long, thin magazines on the west side behind the facade overlooking the west court. And this is just an impression of the great staircase in what are probably the residential quarters of Knossos, with the famous upside down columns with red shafts and black capitals. Now, one of the curious things about the Aegean is that we don't have things like these. We don't have text combined with images to mark out rulers. And this has led people to query whether Crete was in fact typical in having a single ruler at the apex of this society, or whether it was more what's called heterarchical, various groups who were in control and sort of vying with each other and so on. it's quite likely that the palace areas before the palaces were built, because they were places of congregation, were in fact places of congregation for different groups. And it may even be that in the first palace phase that there was a sort of corporate body that was in control of these large spaces and ensuring that everything ran well. Around about 1700 BC, there was a series of earthquakes which destroyed the palaces, and they were rebuilt into what we would call the new palaces. And it seems likely in that phase that Knossos became predominant in the island in that period. One possible answer to why we don't have text combined with images to mark out rulers is because a lot of the way in which these things were carried out, these rituals were carried out, was in the moment, live with oral performance. And we have a little hint of that in these frescoes, which, as you see, are from an interior space in the northern part of the palace at Knossos. This one here is actually on this wall right here. And I hope you'll recognize that these walkways that go across are the walkways that crisscross the west court in front of the palace. So this, with its massive audience of women here and men behind, seems to be an audience watching a dance performance in this very space around the palace. And it emphasizes the importance of live performance, of oral performance. And that goes along with the paintings that are on the walls, the interior walls of the palaces, which define routes. So they often go parallel to the plane along which you would pass, going up a staircase, for example, or going along a corridor. And I like to think of this type of fresco decoration as participatory, in the sense that you are in the room, you are participating with what the frescoes are depicting on the wall, in contrast to the small scale miniature frescoes, which I like to call panoptic, in the sense that you can grasp them in a single view. You don't have to move into them and behave with them as you do as participatory views. And this is very clear not actually on the island of, not in the site of Akrotiri, because the frescoes are no longer in situ there, but they're preserved in the museum. But in those buildings, which were so well preserved by the massive eruption which covered the town of Akrotiri with ash. So you can see both types of fresco decoration were operating here. This is the famous miniature fresco from the West House at Thera, and there it is in its actual position on the wall. And there are two fisher boys who are almost at life size, and they would be almost as if you were accompanying them in the room. And here's another diagram here by Clary Palivou, who's done a lot of work on this, the way in which architecture and people interact with one another. Now, particularly in the second palace period, the new palace period, so the period from about 1700 to about 1450 BC, the Cretan material culture becomes very, very widespread throughout the islands, particularly the Cycladic islands. The islands of Thera, Milos, and Chios, or Tsia, as it's called nowadays, show very strong elements of Minoan culture, obviously, particularly in ceramics, but also in weaving technology as well. And it's even been called, these have even been termed the Western string, because it's thought that there was a sort of preferential movement of materials out of Crete, but also materials back from Crete, in particular from the metal-rich area of the Lavrion, with its lead mines, from which you could produce silver and possibly copper as well. But there were also connections through the west, through the island of Kythera, to the southern Peloponnese, and to southwest Anatolia as well, particularly to the site of Miletus and Iassos and so on. And just a sort of flavor of what this Minoanization meant is given by this tiny artifact that you see in the top left, which was discovered recently in the Griffin Warrior at Pylos. It's only a few centimeters across, but it depicts a very specific battle scene published by Sharon Stocker and Jack Davis in Hesperia only a few years ago. And this is probably, if not a Minoan work, at least very, very Minoan in its essence. And it points to the way in which the cultures of the mainland and the cultures of Crete and the islands are coming closer and closer together, almost certainly sharing languages. So most of the people, who certainly the traders, would have been bilingual or even trilingual throughout this period. And then, of course, Thera erupts. The date is disputed. It's been dated by radiocarbon. It's been dated by the discovery of ash in ice cores. It's been dated by correlating dendrochronology with frost rings, etc. And we still don't know for sure the exact date, but it may well be around about 1600 BC, maybe a little bit later, perhaps 1550. The important point is that it does not bring down the palaces on Crete. There's at least a century between the eruption of Thera and the destruction of the palaces that seems to happen around about 1450 BCE. But for certain, it disrupted immediately the trade routes that went through Thera to the mainland and back again. But also, if you think about the way in which those palaces stood on their ritual foundation as permanent indicators of continuity, this was a major disruption, psychological disruption, if you like, to the way people thought. For whatever reason, Crete seems to have been, some people would say, taken over, conquered by mainland Greeks, whom we call Mycenaeans, but certainly by the second half of the 15th century BCE, so by 1400 BC, the language of administration on Crete was Greek, written in the Linear B script, which was deciphered by the man in the top left, Michael Ventris, and there's one of his most famous work note on the script, in which he very modestly describes this as a frivolous digression, and so on. And it's actually 70 years this year since Ventris' decipherment in 1952. The Linear B texts give us the opportunity to identify places which are named in the text, places like Tylissos, just to the west of Knossos, that you see almost in the center of the slide there, Hania, or Kidonia in its ancient name, that you see in the top, not quite the top left, but the left there, and Festos, which you see over on the bottom left there as well. Interestingly, Knossos does not seem to have controlled the eastern part of the island, and that again emphasizes the way in which the island tends to segment because of its topography as well. So we now got at least 3 languages on the island. We have the initial Neolithic language that was brought. We have possibly 1 or more languages brought in at the end of the 3rd millennium BCE, and we have Greek brought in sometime probably before, but certainly by the end of the 15th century. And as I said, the whole Eastern Mediterranean collapses. The Hittite Empire goes down, Ugarit is destroyed, there are destructions on Cyprus, Egypt goes into a period of invasion and backwardness, as it were, and the Aegean is no exception to this. And when Crete re-emerges after that period, say around about 700 BCE, it's a fragmented island. And that picture is reflected in the Odyssey by Homer, where he describes it as an island of 90 cities, talks about the different, as we would say, ethnicities, populations on the island, particularly the Eteocretans, the Kidonians, the Dorians, and the godlike Pelasgians, and so on. So whatever the truth of the epic, of course, the notion that in the 7th century or the end of the 8th century BCE, people saw Crete in that way, I think is quite important. So I'm going to go much more quickly now because time is running out, but just to show you some of the main city-states, the Kidonia, as I say, Hania in the far west, Aptera, which I'll just correct our introducer, is actually to the west, to the east of Hania on this promontory here, and that's its lovely Hellenistic and Roman theatre, recently restored with the White Mountains behind. The site of Gortyn, which of course by the Roman period, by 67 BC, became the capital of Crete and of the neighboring mainland, the African mainland of Cyrenaica, again pointing to that notion of the sea as connector not just a separator between areas where you have good transportation. Two of the more famous monuments at Gortin, the Law Code under this protective brick cover, and the famous basilica, the 6th century Basilica of St. Titus, one of the most important early Christian monuments on Crete. And then the little city-state which sits above Elunda and Aios Nikolaos, the site of Lato, which you see there on the right. Now, there aren't actually 100 city-states that we know of on Crete, but there are quite a large number for the size of the island. There are 40 on this map, and I don't want you to identify any of them. The main point is to say that there was a tendency for the larger city-states like Knossos and Liktos, this is Knossos, this is Liktos, this is Gortin, to amalgamate smaller ones. So this is Gortin amalgamating Festos, for example, Knossos amalgamating Tilissos, and Hierapitna amalgamating Pressos and Istron here in the east. So that by the time you get to the Roman period, there are fewer of these city-states, but these places continue to be important into the following Byzantine, Arab, Byzantine again, Venetian and Ottoman period. And each of the crosses marks one of the bishoprics of Crete at the time. And here we are about a millennium later in the Venetian period, where we have this quadripartite division, largely driven by the mountains here, here, and here, and the four main towns on the north coast, Candia, as it's come to be known after its Arab name, Khandaks, Retimo, Rethymno, and Khania, Chania, and Setia in the far west. It's very interesting that when Crete has a single defined center, like Gortin or Candia or Heraklion nowadays, it's imposed from outside when it becomes part of an empire. It is not an island that naturally lends itself to having a single center. And we can think of this in sort of larger spatial terms as Crete moving locations within these much, much larger imperial forms. So, for example, by the early Byzantine period, not the earliest Byzantine period, the 7th century and the 8th century, Crete forms a boundary between Byzantium and Islam. I could actually invert that, because in the 9th century, when the Arab conquest, Crete is the boundary between Islam and the Byzantine Empire. And then, of course, with the coming of Venice in the wake of the Fourth Crusade in 1204, Crete becomes a sort of eastern bastion of the Venetian maritime empire, running all the way from Venice down the Ionian Islands and so on to Crete, against the Ottoman Empire, with its center, of course, at Istanbul there. And the modern, let's put that in inverted commas because they've been changed relatively recently, but the modern county boundaries, or eparchias as they're called, of Crete, also largely followed those same structures, showing how, if you like, sort of politics and administration go hand in hand with topography. And I won't go into great detail there, but you'll notice the four different major areas, the nomi as they're called. So with the Fourth Crusade, as I just said, Crete becomes Venetian after 1204, probably 1211 is when it's properly colonized by the Venetians. And it's a very rich period. It's a period in which we see the building of the towns and fortifications at Rethymno, at Chania, the fortress of Spinalonga, of course, which was a fortress long before it was a leper colony. Do read Victoria Hislop's book, The Island, about it. And then you get these very strange Italianate looking buildings in the middle of the Cretan countryside, like this village at Etia in East Crete. And of course, important figures like El Greco, Dominikos Theotokopoulos, late 16th and into the 17th century, painter, of course, who went on to live in Spain, and the Eratocratus, a sort of fusion Western Eastern romance, very much in the sort of Western chivalric tradition, but composed in indigenous Cretan dialect by Vincentzos Kornaros, again in the early 17th century. And then after a long battle from 1645 until 1669, and you're seeing an image of that siege in progress, Heraklion or Candia fell to the Ottoman Turks, and the island remained Ottoman until 1898, when it was under protectorship of the great powers, and eventually became part of the Greek nation state in 1913, which is referred to as Union or Enosi in Greek. And this means that unlike many places in Greece, there are surviving minarets, because it was only relatively late that the Ottomans left the island. Many of them have been destroyed, but it's still possible to see cityscapes like this in Hanya with minarets. And then Union, as I said, in 1913, largely a very important figure in that is Eleftherios Venizelos, who went on, of course, to be Prime Minister of Greece a number of times, shown here, and the tombs of the Venizelos family high over the city of Hanya. That's Hanya in the background, a beautiful spot on the Akrotiri to overview the city. And Nikos Kazantzakis, of course, one of the most famous Cretan authors, author of Zorba the Greek in his English title. And John Pendlebury is also buried on Crete. John Pendlebury was one of the British School at Athens Knossos curators just before the Second World War, and he was shot in 1941, and his grave is in the Souther Bay Cemetery, which is down on the low ground, actually behind the Akrotiri from that view. So just a few final thoughts. Crete clearly has a very long history. In fact, if you go back to the very earliest possible settlers of the Paleolithic period, well over 9,000 years, but a continuous settled history of over 9,000 years. It's an island, and always has been, connected and separated by the sea, even at the last glacial maximum when sea levels were lower, but still there. And it's a diverse island. It's diverse in its topography, not least in its relief. You can go from high mountains to the coast, very short distances, and that brings differences of ecology. The olive doesn't grow above a certain level in Crete, whereas it's widespread at low levels, etc., etc. Its language is different. Even modern Cretan is different from other dialects of Greek, and there are at least 4 that we know of, including a rather mysterious one called Etio-Cretan that we can't understand. It may be one of the indigenous languages that came in the Bronze Age or before the Bronze Age. Greek, Latin, Phoenician, we know, was written on the island at some point. And this diversity is reflected in the island's traditions, in its architecture, as we've seen, in its material culture, and in that sort of general feel of mixture of being between East and West. So I'll end there, and thanks for your attention.
Thank you so much. That was really, really illuminating. And you've covered, most of the stuff that I certainly wanted to find out about, which is great. But I do have quite a few questions that have been submitted by the people watching. Some of them were before, and some of them have been during. If we've got time, can I put a couple of them to you now?
Of course.
Okay, it's going to be difficult choosing which ones to, because they're all genuinely brilliant questions. In light of what we know about Cretan languages, this is from Graham Wrightson. In light of what we know about Cretan languages, why is linear A untranslated, and what language do you think it may represent?
Right, so it's readable because most of the signs in linear A continue into linear B. So we can actually read the signs of linear A, but when we read them, it doesn't make any sense to us, unlike linear B, which when it was deciphered started to make sense in Greek to Michael Ventris, and it snowballed from there. Now that could mean 2 things. It could mean that it's a language that has no parallels, like Sumerian, for example, early on in Mesopotamia, an isolate, as we call it, or Basque in Spanish, in modern Spain, for example. In which case, our best bet is to find a bilingual, which says this word in linear A means this word in this known language, or some other form of or just a massive amount more text. We have about less than a tenth of the text available in linear A than we have in linear B. So part of it is simply sheer numbers of text to work on, and many of those are very short texts. So we need some nice long texts. In a way, that's a bit like Etruscan, where some of the very longest texts, the Zagreb mummy, for example, and so on, would help. So I hope that answers that.
Yeah, great, thank you.
It will be deciphered. Not in my lifetime, though.
Okay. Related, I guess, what's the latest research on the Festos disc? That's from Adonai Herrera Martinez, and that's the one that I briefly showed in my little presentation. And some people are even suggesting it could be a fake. Do you think it's genuine artifact?
In a nutshell, I think the balance is on it being genuine. It's got a fairly good story of how it was found, and it was found in a plausible location. Sadly, in a sense, it is almost literally, it's either undecipherable or infinitely decipherable, because it's more or less unique. I know you can't be more or less unique. The signs are unique, and it clearly looks like language in the sense that there are little groups of signs and there's some patterns in there, but we haven't got it doesn't belong to another script that we can read. So unfortunately, we can either decipher it as many times as we like, and believe me, I've seen a lot. I used to collect them, but I've given up. So sadly, I'm afraid that one will elude us until, again, there's some illuminating find which proves that it was actually whatever it actually was.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's the one that really intrigued me when I was doing my research beforehand, I have to say.
And it's tiny too, which most people don't realise.
It's what? Say that again. It's
tiny.
It's tiny. Oh, I see.
Everyone thinks it's about this big, but it's actually really quite small.
Goodness. I've got an unusual question by Kahir King. What site is older, Knossos or New Grange in Ireland?
Knossos. New Grange is probably Neolithic, right? So it'll be somewhere around about 3,000, 3,500. Knossos, its earliest phase is about 7,000, just after 7,000.
Wow, okay. So there's a whopping difference.
And of course, this is one of those things where Gordon Childe in the early part of the 20th century was trying to link certain things like the circular buildings in Los Millares in Spain with circular tombs on Crete, on the principle that they must have diffused from one to the other. And then it was radiocarbon that actually broke that chain of chronology.
Sarah Sharp is asking, she's always wondered what the Minoans, which was a name invented by the archaeologists, were really called. Does anybody know what the Minoans called themselves?
We don't, but I'm certain they didn't call themselves Minoans, and she's absolutely right. It was a term, actually goes back to the 19th century in Germany, but Evans adopted it in the early 20th century, not right away. His first palace he excavated, he called a Mycenaean palace, which is interesting, but he soon adopted the term Minoans, and then they got an S on the end, so they became a people, and so that's how we refer to them. The best we can do is to say that Egypt knew of Crete, probably the geographical entity Crete, as Keftiu, and the Akkadian-speaking world as Kaptaru. And we have this one document from the mortuary temple of Amenhotep III in Egypt, which shows both Keftiu and Tanai, which is probably Crete and mainland Greece, with some smaller names next to them. But those names seem to be the names of individual sites. So Festos is there, Knossos is there. So it's conceivable that the people thought of themselves as Knossian or Festian, or Kidonian, and so on, and what they called themselves as a group, if they called themselves anything, is unknown.
Oh, well, maybe we'll find that missing tablet somewhere, or something that will give us a clue. But you're right. I think maybe just the individual cities, maybe they didn't think of themselves as a united group. I've had a question from Pavel Krupa, who says Santorini has been mentioned, obviously, and they've been there, and their impression was that Santorini had hosted a more advanced cultural civilization than the Minoan one. And there's obviously speculation that it may have been Plato's Atlantis. Would you have a comment on whether that's the case, on the possibility of it potentially being Atlantis, and whether it was indeed more sophisticated?
I'll do the sophisticated one first. I think what we tend to be victim of there is that there's just so much preserved, that you see things on Santorini that just aren't preserved on Crete, because it's all above ground, as it were, rather than buried. It certainly matches the sophistication of many places on Crete, and I think some people have argued that the people responsible for the fresco painting were actually real masters of the craft, whereas some of the people on Crete weren't quite as good at it. So that's one thing. The Atlantis thing comes about because of this sudden disappearance, and it was Spiridon Marinatos who actually linked the two ideas. I mean, I don't think Crete was Atlantis, but I'm a skeptic on whether Atlantis existed at all. I think it's a story that Plato invented to make a point, and it goes back, of course, to the fact that the Greeks always thought that Egypt was much older than they were, and so knew a lot more about what went on in the past. So it's I think presented as an Egyptian story for that reason. But the link between the destruction has been broken by the chronology. That can't be the case.
Okay, so we can't find an evidence for it, basically, and you think on balance it's likely that Plato was referring to something just as using an example rather than a specific place.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, well, I mean, it would be lovely. Maybe we'll find Atlantis one day, but it certainly is it's a lovely thing to believe that may be out there somewhere to discover. I don't know if we've got time for very many more questions. I think I'm just going to end on Byron Russell's question, which is back to the archaeological restoration at Knossos, which has obviously been much criticised. What's your opinion of it? Can it be reversed? Should it be reversed?
Well, the interesting thing about it is that it itself has become part of archaeology. A few years ago, in fact, when the photograph was taken of the Great Staircase where I'm standing there, we met a restorer who was restoring not the original Minoan frescoes, but Evans's restorations of the Minoan frescoes, and had to research the early 20th century materials in order to be able to do that. I used to hate it. I used to think I was with like Evelyn Waugh, who really hated the reconstructions, partly because they don't look very nice, but also partly because they take away a bit of the imagination. But I've come around to it because I think I understand better now from having read and talked to people that what Evans was trying to do, and he was actually trying to create a museum on the site, and he called it reconstitution. He didn't call it restoration. So he was trying to give people the vision of being able to understand the site. Now, the trouble is he did it in concrete and beton, and so it's a bit irreversible. It would be very difficult to reverse it. But if you want to get a flavour of what Knossos might have looked like, then go to Festos, because that is largely unrestored in that sense. And your imagination can go to work a bit more there.
Oh, great. And we are visiting, obviously, both sites in the tour that you're going to be leading in September. So people that are on that trip will have the chance to compare the two. It's a shame, though. I know that at the Parthenon now, you can get an iPad app, which you hold your iPad up to the Parthenon, and it kind of overlays it with all of the colors and all of the, what it would have looked like in the day. And obviously that would be the perfect thing somewhere like that, somewhere like Knossos, but it's there now. So it's interesting that I agree. It's interesting. And that was the restoration's now 120 years old. So it's almost sort of antique in its own right.
Mm.
So I think we are out of time. Thank you to everyone who sent me questions. I've gone through as many of them as I can, but unfortunately, I think there's enough content certainly about Crete that we could talk for another hour. Thank you so much to everyone for attending. I'm going to just briefly hand back to Claire Baxter from Cambridge just to say goodbye, but thank you all very much for coming. Thank you so much, Professor Bennet. It's been really illuminating.